related to the budget deficit update.
All right. So first of all, there's a QR code on the screen. With this projector and these screens, it is sometimes difficult to see presentations that have lots of numbers. So we are going to get in the habit of putting this QR code up prior to the presentation and at the beginning of the meeting. If anybody wants to scan it and look at the presentation on their device instead of the screen, they can do so. While that is up, I just want to point out that this presentation is part 2 in a continuum of 3 presentations related to second interim. 2 weeks ago, we talked about enrollment. In 2 weeks, we will be at second interim, so we'll be doing the second interim presentation. And tonight, we're expanding on enrollment and talking about LCFF funding as well as an update on the budget deficit. The reason that those two are being mixed in is because LCFF, there were some developments between first interim and second interim that are going to help address the budget deficit. So I'm going to get into the presentation now. As I mentioned, the focus tonight is going to be on our local control funding formula. We're also going to touch upon other means that we're using to address the budget deficit, including the core resolution. And we've talked about this, but I really do want to focus on this a lot tonight because that core resolution, which was passed in December at the same meeting as the fiscal stabilization resolution, is a really big part of how we're addressing the budget deficit and working really hard to keep cuts away from personnel. And then we're going to be getting into some detail of reductions in various types of expenditures. So as always, we're going to talk about the budget timeline, and here we are about 2 weeks away from second interim. The finance teams are working really hard on getting the projections to be as accurate as possible. You've seen this slide before, and I'm going to go through these slides, some of these slides that are repeats. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly so we could focus on the new material. But you've seen this slide before, which is the list of all revenue and all expenditures. So the revenue is in green, the expenditures are in purple. We're going to be focusing on the multi-year projection. And once again, I want to emphasize the importance of multi-year projections. We hear comments that the district's going to have a certain amount of fund balance at the end of this year. And that's not insignificant. But as it relates to our financial responsibility, our fiscal responsibility, which is overseen to a certain extent by Orange County Department of Education, they require a 3-year multi-year projection. We can't just look at the current year. We have to look at the spending patterns, the revenue patterns, and look at where those are going to have us land at the end of the 3-year multi-year period. So that's what we're looking at here, current year through 26-27. Once again, revenue in green, expenditures are in purple. And if we do a total, what we see is over the course of those 3 years, we have an overall budget deficit of $194.7 million, which means over the course of those 3 years, we are spending $194.7 million than we are taking in. Expenditures are outpacing revenue by that dollar figure. We're going to come back to that 194.7 million figure later in the presentation, and as we go through the presentation, I'm going to show you all of the components that are contributing to addressing that budget deficit. So, revenue. I really do want to spend a lot of time on LCFF. It is our primary source of revenue. Current year forecasted to be 71% of overall revenue. Once all of the COVID relief grant fundings is spent down, we'll get back to LCFF being about 75%. So fully 3/4 of our revenue is based on LCFF. Now, this is a repeat slide. Just want to refresh everyone's memory. 2 weeks ago, we talked about enrollment, and we showed a couple of different ways to look at enrollment and do projections. One was cohort progression. So we're just following a class from first grade all, one year to second grade the next, and so on and so forth, to see how many of those cohort stay with all the members of the cohort, or how many drop off. And what this showed is that the most serious drop-offs were in the elementary grade spans, which is an indication of a number of factors, including the economic pressures of living in Santa Ana. We also looked at historical enrollment, so not looking at cohorts, but just looking year over year, what are the patterns there? And same thing, we saw the biggest drop-offs in the elementary grade levels. And this is the slide that we pretty much ended on in that discussion, where we looked at the actual percentages of drop-off, and what you see there on the first through fifth grade span, the 12-year decrease was 44.6% of our students, significantly more than we see in the 6th through 8th grade span or the high school grade span. So the takeaway from 2 weeks ago was that because of that elementary drop-off, and because that group of students is going to be moving into intermediate and then high school, and the patterns that are driving elementary are going to continue for the students in those elementary grade spans, our LCFF is going to be majorly impacted in future years. So that was the message from 2 weeks ago, and it was focused on enrollment. But enrollment is not the only thing that determines what our LCFF funding is. It's based on 4 factors: cost of living adjustment, the enrollment, which we just mentioned, the attendance factor, so what percentage of students who are enrolled are attending on a daily basis, and finally, our unduplicated pupil count or unduplicated pupil percentage, however you want to refer to it. And this is very hard to see, and I'm going to go to some slides that zoom in on this, but this is the actual spreadsheet that we use to do LCFF projections. And once again, I'm going to zoom in. So the first thing that we're going to look at is ADA, and I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. There is a hold harmless in place on ADA, and we are very grateful for that hold harmless. And the way that it works is, for a district in decline, as we are, what we're funded on in a given year is not necessarily our ADA that year, but the average of the ADA from the 3 prior years. What that looks like is for the current year, 24-25, if you look at ADA in that 9 through 12 grade span, in 21-22 it was 13,914, and then the next year 12,820, and then the next year 12,180. And then if you average those 3 together, you get the 12,971. So for the current year, for the 9 through 12th grade span, we're actually funded on 12,971, even though our actual ADA, if you go up a little bit, is 11,869. And as I've mentioned before, we're very grateful for that hold harmless. Without it, we would be in much worse financial shape than we are. Also want to talk about our unduplicated pupil count, and there's also, it's not called a hold harmless, but the unduplicated pupil percentage that's used to calculate our supplemental and concentration is an average from the current year and the 2 prior years. So same way that it works here. If you look at, and this is for next year, so if you look at 23-24 all the way through 25-26, what we're funded at is the average of those 3 years, which is 90.8%. I do want to point out, while we're on this slide, UPP is very important. This is the source of the supplemental concentration, and it has a huge impact on our budget. And if you go back to 21-22, you see that we were all the way down at 81% and then 83.3% the year after. And it wasn't until last year that we finally started to see some numbers that more accurately reflected what the demographics are of Santa Ana, and we're starting to get to the unduplicated pupil percentage that that is our potential. Now, turning to the actual assumptions, this slide shows what we were at first interim, and I'm just by way of example, I'm going to show 24-25. The COLA for the current year was 1.07, a very anemic COLA. The enrollment, 36,068. The attendance factor, so the percentage that students are attending at first interim, we forecasted 95%. and our unduplicated pupil count was 84.4%. And I'm going to take you back to first interim. If you recall, the reason we had the UPP so low is we hadn't yet completed some of the direct certification efforts and some other validation efforts. And we were able to complete those efforts in the month of December and early January, which is why you'll shortly see that the UPP has gone up. With all of those assumptions, the LCFF for the current year was forecast at first interim at $577.2 million. But there were some changes between first interim and now. We're always going off the most current information that's available to us. So as it relates to cost of living adjustment, current year is still the same. At first interim, we were looking at 2.93% COLA. That is what the state was telling us. Since that time, and we're not even may revise yet, but since that time in the governor's budget, that COLA has been downcast to 2.43%. So we lost 0.5% of COLA for next year, although the next year it's a slight uptick. Enrollment, current year, not a whole lot of movement, but if you look at next year, and I'm going to spend some time on this because this is very important. Enrollment for next year at first interim, we had 34,121. Based on the information from our demographer, they're forecasting 34,571. But I need to add a note of caution here. Nothing in the cohort progression analysis or the historical analysis indicates that the enrollment patterns are getting better. And we've challenged the demographer, and we've had multiple conversations and email exchanges about how they came to that number. The folks in facilities and in business who work with the demographer, we are not comfortable with this forecast yet. And it's going to take future conversations with the demographer for them to really point out things. So between now and adopted budget, we will fine tune that. But for now, for purposes of second interim, we are going with the demographer's projections because that's all we do. We take the latest information that's available to us and we use that information for our assumptions. For attendance factor, at first interim, we were at 95%, and we had forecasted some pretty significant increases in attendance factor based on the fact that we were, coming out of COVID, and we had a lot of plans to try and get our attendance up. However, since there's been changes at the federal level, and students are not at ease, and there's been protests and all that, our attendance has dropped drastically to where we can no longer forecast that 95%. So what we've done is we have downcast that to 94% and taken that through the multi-year. There'll be opportunities for us to upgrade that later, but for now, based on what we're seeing and really not necessarily any relief in sight, we're at 94% attendance factor. For our unduplicated pupil count, as I mentioned earlier, 84.4% at first interim, some very aggressive efforts on direct certification and validation, and that UPP at second interim will be 92.1%, and we've got some incremental increases in the future years. I believe our potential is even higher than that, but a big part of our unduplicated pupil percentage is based on familyizing, which is grouping students together in a family, which requires communication between the district and the families to confirm that people are living together. And given the federal situation right now, there may be people who are hesitant to talk to the district and divulge certain things. So that is why we maxed out at 94%. I believe that our potential for unduplicated pupil is probably between 96 and 97%. So that brings us to the actual second interim presentation, second interim assumptions. So you see those same numbers there, and what that's done is that has resulted especially with the increase in UPP, that has resulted in an increase in our LCFF current year, next year, and in the third year of our multi-year. So we have now, and this is great news, we have decreased the deficit by $28.9 million, and with nothing other than revenue enhancement. And that is the least painful way of addressing a budget deficit, is revenue enhancement. So we're going to continue to really focus on that. And there's even really potentially much better news. So on these next few slides, I'm going to show scenarios of what happens if we see increases in UPP or attendance factor. So on this first slide, if we see an increase of 1% in our unduplicated pupil percentage, going from 93% to 94% next year, and from 94 to 95% in 26-27, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, that increases our revenue over the 3 years an additional $3.3 million. And that's doing nothing other than working hard to make sure that we're doing direct certification properly. We're supplementing that with income applications. We're supplementing that with efforts to determine what families are living together so we could extend that direct certification benefit and increase our unduplicated pupil percentage. For attendance factor, it's even a bigger impact. So for a 1% increase in attendance factor, going from 94% to 95% in both of the out years, our revenue will increase almost $6 million. And there is nothing bad about increasing attendance. That is, not only does it produce more revenue, but it helps the students become engaged and achieve better results. So that's really all I wanted to say on LCF. There's a lot of potential there, but that is not the only area that we're working on in order to keep the reductions away from staff. I mentioned the core resolution earlier today, and this slide illustrates why the core resolution is so important. And this is from the first interim presentation, and it's our ending fund balance broken down into unrestricted and restricted, with the unrestricted being the blue band and the restricted being the red. And what you see as we go toward the last year of the multi-year projection is that blue band is a smaller and smaller percentage. That creates the need to provide as much flexibility as possible in the restricted funding. And that was the importance of the core resolution that was passed in December. So what that does is it rebenches what the district is capable of affording with its unrestricted funds. So based on the fact that we have declining enrollment and anemic COLAs, we can't afford as much as we used to. So we rebench what the base is or what the core is. And this allows for some expenditures to be funded then with restricted or categorical funds, the funds that were in red, in the red bands. By way of example, if we have 30 base funded counselors, that's $3.9 million. And I want to state something really important here. When we talk about establishing a base or establishing a core, it's not making any negative remark about that position. It's not saying that that position's not important. In fact, it's just the opposite. What we're trying to do is use the core resolution to protect positions, to protect our ability to continue to afford this. So what I'm about to say is that if we established as a base that the district can afford only one counselor for every elementary school, that becomes the base. And that allows us then to say, all right, we're going to fund 15 counselors with base dollars, and we're going to fund 15 counselors with categorical dollars. So it allows us to use the categorical funds and maintain and sustain the services and the positions that we really need to have. Preliminary analysis, and I really want to emphasize this. The district leadership team has come together and done brainstorming on what we can do with this core resolution. That very preliminary analysis shows potential for about $42 million. It's going to be very important for us moving forward on the core resolution to make sure that we get as much input as possible from all of the education partners. So after the second interim presentation in 2 weeks, we will be sitting down a few days later with our labor partners, and we'll be having community town halls that same week. And we've also got some meetings with students that are currently being scheduled. Those meetings are going to be focused on the fiscal stabilization resolution as well as the core resolution, making sure that everybody provides input and we get buy-in on how we're going to move forward on the core resolution. So 42 million is what we've identified, and we can remember that figure because we're going to come back to it. But the final core resolution, once we get all that input, we will come back to bring that before the board in the April meeting. So we've talked about enhancing revenue. We've talked about core resolution. Now we need to talk about the actual expenditure reductions. And once again, we're working as hard as possible to try and keep these reductions away from staff. So, but considering that staff is 80% of the budget, there's really no way to do it without that. However, because we offered the supplemental early retirement plan, we were able to get 160 teachers and counselors to retire early, and that saves $19 million over the course of the multi-year. It's personnel, but it's not a layoff. The actual layoff is over the savings over the course of the multi-year is $53 million, which represents right now 27% of the overall measures that we're doing to address the budget deficit. For non-personnel, by taking back some general fund contributions to deferred maintenance and by pausing some capital projects, we were able to save $24 million. Other capital expenditures, such as vehicles and other high dollar expenditures, we're able to save $1 million. And then supplies and services, we're able to save $27 million. On services, some examples of what we've already identified. We're doing a more thorough review of software, making sure that every software purchase is absolutely necessary and necessary in the current year. We have curtailed virtually every conference and travel, with the exception of student travel and conferences that are necessary to maintain certifications to continue to provide services. So those are the biggest examples of the services that we're eliminating. So what that does is, looking through the multi-year projection, starting on the bottom at like the 5 o'clock position, you see in green LCFF revenue enhancement. That addressed 15% of the multi-year deficit. The core resolution, 22%. Deferred maintenance and capital, 12%. Supplies and services, 14%. Reduction in force, as I mentioned earlier, 27%, and the SERP 10. So 27%, a little over 1/4 of everything that we're doing is related to personnel. I don't want to discount the impact that this is having to the 280 individuals. I'm never going to say that. No one in the district is going to say that it is a big deal. But we are working really hard to keep the reductions away from staffing as much as possible. There's been talk about finding other ways, and some of the things that were mentioned would be a structured attrition plan. Now, this slide is not the attrition. This slide is what we showed back at first interim, and this was what the ending fund balance would have been if we did not do the reduction in force at all. But what I do want to show you is that it's a very similar slide when we look at what attrition looks like, if it's only attrition. And the reason that there's very little difference between no RIF and just the attrition only plan is because we get very little attrition in the areas where we are overstaffed. so elementary schools and certain credentials. If we have attrition on a special education teacher, we have to backfill that position. So that's not real attrition. We're still having to expend money on that position. So really, the attrition that we see every year is 15, 20, 25 teachers, and that is nowhere near the 280. So we just can't do it with attrition. It's unfortunately impossible. We've crunched the numbers, we've looked at it every way, and it's just not a viable solution. And we heard tonight, and I don't have a slide for it, but I did crunch the numbers. We heard tonight, well, maybe you could delay the layoff. And I heard that earlier in the day also. So we crunched the numbers. And although so what you see here on the attrition only, you see that we're still in the negative. We're still below zero. If we just postpone the RIF, we're not below zero, but we are below the 2% required reserves. We're at $9.5 million in 26-27, which means that we would be qualified budget certification. And that's the last thing I want to talk about tonight. We were positive at first interim, and we're going to be positive at second interim. I've seen the preliminary reports at second interim. We're still going to be positive. But it's important to note that we're positive based on the fact that this board approved the fiscal stabilization resolution in December. That, if you recall, that was done at the same meeting as the first interim. It was actually the extension. It was 2 days later, but it was the same basic meeting on the same agenda. That fiscal stabilization resolution, the information in that resolution was also part of our first interim assumptions. So yes, we're positively certified, and yes, we're positively certified, which means we'll be fine for 3 years. But we're positively certified because of the fiscal stabilization resolution, because of the assumption that we were going to have the SERP, the layoffs, and the other reductions, as well as the core resolution. I'm in very frequent conversation with OCDE so that they understand everything that we're doing to address the issue, so that they have the level of confidence that they can affirm our positive certifications. And these aren't slides, but I just did some quick research today about positive and positive certification and the importance of it. I'm looking at a school services report from last year, and it was the second interim certifications from last year. And what they showed was the pattern between 22-23 year and the 23-24 year. So in 22-23, 10 districts in the state of California were qualified. By second interim of last year, that had more than doubled to 23. Back in 22-23, 3 districts were negative. By last year, it was 6. And you also see in the news that other districts now are announcing layoffs. We were very transparent, and we started this communication way back in November. So the draft of the fiscal stabilization resolution, the draft of the core resolution came before you in November. They were approved in December. As I said then, and I'll say again tonight, the purpose of those resolutions was communication. Two pieces of communication. Number one, communicating with OCDE so that they have the confidence that we know how to address our budget deficit, and communication with our staff. We want to be as transparent as possible so that people who could be affected by a reduction in force had as much time as possible to explore other opportunities. Since that time, other districts have announced layoffs, and we're not quite to March 15th, so there will be other districts that announce layoffs over the next few weeks. We know that San Francisco Unified, more than 800 layoffs. Pasadena has talked about 150. Coachella Valley, 322. And there are other districts, Pajaro Valley, San Jose, Fremont, Hayward. We don't have numbers for them, but they've announced intentions to do that. So what we're seeing here, the pattern, is that other districts are affected by the same thing that we are. Declining enrollment, the cessation of COVID relief grant funds, anemic COLAs. Everyone is being affected by this. It has affected Santa Ana more profoundly due to the fact that during the pandemic, we added a significant number of positions to provide supports to students and kept those supports in place for as long as possible. So because of that, we are in this position. The positive certification is incredibly important, and it has nothing to do with pride upon the part of the district. There are very practical negative effects of going qualified or negative. The first of which is that a fiscal advisor will be appointed by the County Office of Education. And that just happened in Oakland. So Oakland is now, they're not negative, they're I believe they're qualified, and they're still paying off a state loan. So they're in the unique position of having a state oversight as well as county oversight again. Once that happens, and if you read the articles about Oakland, you're going to see that the focus is the state and the county saying to the district, this is your last chance to take control of this. If you don't take control of it, we're going to take control of it. So it's important for this district to maintain control over the budget and not have somebody from the outside come in and have veto power over budget decisions. And the other reason that positive certification is so important, as I've mentioned before, is the credit rating. If we go qualified, it negatively impacts our credit rating, which means the next time that we go out to issue a bond, we are on the hook for higher interest rates, which negatively impacts the taxpayers and negatively impacts the district's ability to deliver projects. So the positive certification is super important. And just one last point, I'm going to read a statement from the Fiscal Stabilization Resolution that was passed in December. This statement came from OCDE. OCDE told basically every district in Orange County that was experiencing deficit spending to put this in either the first interim report or in a fiscal stabilization resolution. And it says, be it further resolved that the Board of Education, in considering approval of the 24-25 first interim budget report, acknowledges its fiduciary responsibility to maintain fiscal solvency for the current year and the subsequent 2 fiscal years. That is why we had positive certification, because of the fiscal stabilization resolution. And that is my presentation, and I will take any questions that you have.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hacker, for your presentation. At this point, I'll turn it over to my colleagues for any questions or comments. Please add your name to the speaker list. Ms. Lepsak?
No, that was a good presentation. And thank you for addressing some of the comments tonight. That was helpful. I mean, is there any way to just do 5% cuts with everybody and then save the jobs?
That has to be negotiated.
It's not as easy as it looks, huh? Okay.
Dr. Alvarez?
I know that there's a lot of unvariables. Everything's up in the air in regards to federal funding, state funding. The governors may revise coming up. But I just had a question about our ability to generate revenue through some of our different classifications. The workers, our employees that are working in the mental health field, we can get reimbursed for doing the ACEs assessment. We can get reimbursed for doing providing services linked to the needs identified in the ACEs assessment. And I don't know if you have any answer for this, and if you don't, that's okay. But I was just wondering how we sort of like figured out or estimated how much we could generate, how much revenue we could generate by billing everything to Medi-Cal?
So it is hard to come up with those projections, and the harder part is the cash flow related to that. Those reimbursements are paid years after the paperwork is submitted. So it's hard to incorporate that into a budget assumption. We obviously, once we see that revenue, we book it. We book that revenue, but more often than not, it is coming at least a year after we've done the work and submitted the paperwork. But there is absolutely revenue there.
But thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Ms. Brazier-Aceves?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hacker, for the presentation. Thank you for outlining the plan that the district has put together. I know we received a lot of valid questions from staff, from the community. So thank you for walking us through this. You answered a lot of the questions that I had. So I'm just looking through to see some things that maybe would be helpful to highlight again. So I know one of the proposed alternative solutions that some of the staff brought up tonight and public speakers was, why can't we put this off for 1 year? With valid concern of, okay, for those who are going to be impacted, give us 1 more year to put a plan together. Can you, I know you did speak to this, but can you highlight what the way that we've approached this, or the district has asked the board to, approve and your plan for approaching this, how you did take that into account as much as possible as far as the time frame versus what's the norm from other districts? You did touch upon that. And then the second piece to my question is, can you again just very clearly, and you did, but just one more time, kind of, because we don't have a visual, but if you can go over the numbers that you crunched. I know that that's something folks have reached out to me personally, and I've reached out to you multiple times asking, can we look at it this way? Can we look at it that way? But so that folks have that same information that we've been having access to.
Yes, and we are always running different scenarios. I mean, we're looking at all sorts of assumptions, and when we look at reducing positions, the unfortunate reality is that if you hold off for a year, then typically the cuts have to be deeper, because if we make that reduction in 25-26, then we have the savings in 25-26 and in 26-27. Whereas if we postpone it till 26-27, we only have 1 year of savings. And unfortunately, as it relates to our budget, that puts us, not a whole lot, but it puts us below 2% required reserves. Now, there's a lot of things that can happen between now and the time that we go to adopted budget. I'm going to be super honest, with my eye on what's happening in Washington and what's happening in Sacramento, I don't anticipate a whole lot of good news coming. And let me just refresh your memory that a lot of the revenue, the state revenue, which then translates into school district revenue, is based on personal income tax and in large part based on capital gains, which means as the stock market goes K-12 education. And what's happening in Washington right now is not good for the stock market. And so there's a lot of risk. So we have things going on, the tariffs and some very, very unusual economic theories being tested, which historically prove to cause recession and inflation and negatively impact the stock market, all three of which are bad for school districts. So our backs are already in the corner. Our backs are already against the wall. We're right at 2% in the third year. And I wish there were good news on the horizon. All I see, and one of the speakers spoke about it tonight, is instability. And we won't know until the May revise, and maybe even after, what our revenue is going to be next year. So unfortunately, the postponing by a year, it takes us qualified, and I don't see a silver lining where any additional revenue can bump us up above that qualified threshold.
Could you explain what the difference is for us as a school district if we become qualified? Because even if we wanted to gamble, right? You crunched the numbers and you said that we can see where it will land us, right, in the negative in the third year. But we can't. Can we do that and wait and see and hope that things get better based on our standard that we're held to by the state and the county, in comparison to other like city, county, other entities, because of our multi-year budget that's unique? They're looking at it from now till the third year out. They don't. My understanding is, please correct me if I'm wrong, do they allow us to say we want to give it one more year and we're going to count on these factors?
It's a great question, and school districts are definitely different than other public entities because we are required by Assembly Bill 1200 back in the 70s to have the 3-year multi-year projection. And when the county office, when OCD is reviewing our budget, they're looking at that multi-year, and they're not going to accept. We hope this happens. And one example of that is the second interim guidance that came out. And I'll be talking about this in 2 weeks. There will be some one-time revenue next year. We know that. We believe it's going to be about $11 million. Okay. OCD in their guidance specifically said, do not include that in your second interim assumptions. Don't, because nothing is for sure. So you've heard me talk about first interim and second interim and how we have positive, qualified, or negative certifications. The reality is, if OCDE, for whatever reason, lost confidence in our ability to manage the deficit between now and second interim, that would result in a qualified certification. If that happens later, between now and June, then when we do our budget, so for a budget that goes in June, it's not qualified, positive, or negative. It's an approved budget, a disapproved budget, or a conditionally approved budget. So if there was a change in our assumptions related to reductions in positions or reductions in other areas, and they felt that we would not be able to stay above required reserves, they would either disapprove our budget or they would approve it conditionally, and that condition would be to make further cuts.
Ms. Magdaleno?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I'm on slide 34. This shows a through multi-year projection. I'll let you get, I think it's the next one, but yeah. So the layoffs are they're 27% of the measures we are implementing to address the deficit. Are there ways we can focus on the other areas?
We did focus as much as possible on them. That is where we've spent most of our effort over the past few weeks. Really on the core resolution, and we're scheduling meetings with our labor partners and the community to further discuss core resolution so we can maximize the flexibility in our categorical. And in terms of revenue enhancement, if we get so we can't do anything else this year on our UPP. That's locked. That was locked as of January. But attendance, we can still do stuff this year to try and tweak our attendance. We can we can do programs in future years to incentivize sites with if they get better attendance. So there are things that we can continue to do on revenue, but we can't really make those assumptions at this point in time until we see evidence that that's practical.
Okay, thank you. What are some other examples of supplies and services that will be reduced?
So the services, we're really focusing on consultants. We're as I mentioned earlier, software, and on travel. So travel is considered. That's also travel and conferences are considered services. So those are the areas that we're looking at now. But that's also what we're going to be talking to all of our partners. In addition to the core resolution, we're going to be talking to our partners next month about that. And so when we come back to you in April with an update on the core resolution, there will also be an update on the fiscal stabilization and very specific things. Staff has identified a number of things, and every single purchase order is going past me right now. Every single one. And if I need input from additional cabinet members, I reach out to additional cabinet members. So we could look at that. We've stopped furniture. We stopped. So I mentioned services. Let's talk a little bit about capital. So furniture purchases have stopped. Vehicle purchases have stopped. So I stopped four vehicle purchases over the last couple of weeks. So those are just some of the items, but we really want to get our partner input before we come up with a finalized list, because it just doesn't feel right for that to be a top-down decision. We really want to get all of our partners to buy into that.
Okay. I know we extended the SERP deadline. How would that help reduce the impact to the layoffs?
So we don't know how many new individuals will take advantage of the SERP. How many additional appointments?
Yeah, do we have an update for that?
So 20 individuals made appointments to learn about the SERP, and so we'll see how many of them take advantage. For the most part, depending on the credential of the people that take advantage of it, it could be for every person taking advantage of it, it could be reducing the layout by one.
Okay. And I know you were discussing a little bit about the numbers of some of the speakers we're bringing up today, and you said you didn't have a slide to show that. Are you able to create a slide just in case they keep asking those questions? We can provide.
We could put the slide on.
Yeah.
I ran the numbers. I have it here. It just the slide deck is locked, and it was actually posted online, so we couldn't really add it to the slide deck. But we will post. We will probably just add it to this presentation and put it online.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And I know we're talking about, we can't make any sudden movements or sudden changes unless with the layoffs, unless we negotiate with our union partners. I'm not aware. When was the last meeting that we actually had with our SAEA partners?
So I believe my answer to the question about negotiations was related to a salary decrease. That would require negotiations. Layoffs is not something itself that's negotiated. We negotiate the impact of the layoff.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Thank you.
Can we stay on that slide? So supplies and services. So you mentioned, you all are going through and vetting the software, and as well as the consultants. So can you talk a little bit about how what is that vetting process for that you're going through right now with the software, and then what's the vetting process going to be going to look like in the future for consultants? Because I know we heard during public comment today, and we've been hearing around just concerns on our over-reliance on consultants. And so I want to know what the plan forward is to really assess whether or not the services that the consultant is offering the district is really necessary.
Okay. So let me address part of the software, and I think I'm going to ask my partner in crime to come up and talk about the other part of software. So for non-educational software, every license that is going to come before the board, and one of them came before the board tonight, the question that IT has to answer is, what does the software do, or what does the license do? Because in some cases, it's not traditional software. It's things to help a network flow better. So what does it do, and what would happen to students and staff if we didn't have this in place? So what the one that was on there today was for network balancing for ARIES, our student information system. And the answer to that question, what would happen if it went away, is the site level clerks who are inputting attendance. And for a high school, that's one person basically inputting attendance for all classes. The network would get very slow, and it would take away from our operational efficiency. So that's what we're doing on operational software. In terms of academic software,
we do have some processes in place now, but we are actually working to shore that up because we don't think it's rigorous enough. Right now, we have a decentralized process where school sites are able to ask for software. There are things that we actually provide at a district level. We are assembling a panel of folks. It's going to be called a prime panel that will actually be comprised of business folks, educational services folks, a myriad of people coming together that will really vet every single software on the educational side that comes before us. Really try to figure out, if we're going to decide to pilot this, it would be piloted small. We would figure out how we're going to measure outcomes and really look at it carefully to make sure that any decision that we make around any kind of educational software is a good decision. Right now, what we're doing is we're evaluating the effectiveness of all of the things that we currently use. And there are some things that we have decided that we will not be utilizing in the future. Teachers have been apprised of that, So we want to make sure that anything we purchase is really aligned with all of our learning goals. It's aligned with what we actually need, what we're focusing on. So we need to shore up our processes. But I think the first step for us is really evaluating what we're looking at now and what can we do away with that hasn't been effective, or we don't have the usage, right? Mm-hmm. We talked about that before. And maybe it interferes with core instructional time.
Thank you. I appreciate you outlining that plan moving forward. Thanks.
Sure.
And then can we touch on the consultant piece?
You always come up with good acronyms. So for consultants, that right now is a cabinet review, cabinet level review on every consultant.
Okay, so when folks are asking us to include part of the plan to review consultants, we're doing that.
We are doing it.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure that's clear. Can you go to, I think it's slide 28, somewhere between slide 28 and slide 30, the one that relates to the core resolution and categorical funding?
Oh.
I think it was like the slide with the counselors. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how the core resolution is going to give us, or just talk more about how the core resolution is going to give us more flexibility with this categorical funding and how that's directly going to impact the budget deficit? And are there other examples that you can give us aside from counselors where we can look at these areas and consider that?
Yep. So the way that the core resolution impacts the deficit is, so think back to the ending fund balance chart that had the blue band and the red band. What it's doing is it is eating into the deficit of the unrestricted and moving it to restricted. So the 2% required reserves that I talk about, that is unrestricted. We're not judged by OCDE or by the state on what our overall fund balance is. It's what our unrestricted balance. So by moving expenditures from unrestricted to restricted, we're increasing the ending fund balance of unrestricted. So that's how it helps the deficit. And I'm sorry, what was the other question?
Sorry, you gave the example around the counselors.
Yes.
What are the other? Are there other examples that you can share with us, where as we move forward, like we can do this?
So
And consider
another
this.
example, and once again, I don't want anyone to think that by putting people in the core resolution, we are not valuing their positions. But another example would be FACE liaisons. I mean, we could establish a core of one FACE liaison for every other school. And then that would take half of the FACE liaisons and move them to categorical funding. That's in essence also what we're doing with some capital projects. We could move some, in fact, on the deferred maintenance, we did move the deferred maintenance to bond. So that's kind of a core resolution. In that particular case, it's moving from one restricted to another, but it's still freeing up funds that we could flex.
Okay, thank you. I know my time's up. Ms. Brazier-Aceves?
Yeah, thank you. Could we go to slide or page 34? The pie chart again. I wanted to, so you said a few things, and I want to highlight it because there's so much information here, but this is a big area where I hear a lot of our community members and staff asking, and I just really want to make sure that we're providing this information as clearly as possible. So my understanding, Mr. Hacker, is that so the reduction in force that we see here that was in the resolution for the 280 individuals potentially, that makes up only, and I don't want to say only because those are people's, as you said, right? People's livelihoods. So we don't take that lightly. But folks have been asking why are you only doing this? And so I'm glad that you have it outlined here because I want folks to know that it's 27%, if I'm reading this correctly, right? 27% of the overall plan, intentional plan that you and the team have put together.
Absolutely. And every time that I've written something, I try very hard not to use that word only because I feel exactly what you're feeling.
Right.
These are individuals. But it is only 27%. We really worked hard to try and keep the vast majority of the measures away from individuals, away from staffing.
And, being a labor advocate and a school employee myself, I would like it to be zero, right? I think that's what we would all like. And I want to highlight for the community, I know that we've had many, many daily conversations, many of us here and cabinet and staff and with community as well. And I want to thank our Supervisor Sarmiento as well for joining us and our labor partners, SAA, for sitting down to have these conversations and continuing that. And to highlight, so again, because it's not necessarily depicted here, that 27% comes from staffing. But staffing of our overall budget, I almost think we need to have another pie chart next to it, which you have in other presentations. Our staffing is 80%, about 80% of our budget.
That's correct. For the current year, 80% of our expenditures are salaries and benefits.
And so here, let's see, what is it? 73%
So
of the way that we're addressing the deficit is coming from outside of that 80%.
So, not quite.
Because it also includes.
So what we would have to do is put the SERP and the reduction in force together. That's 37%, and then also keep in mind that on that core resolution, a lot of that is personnel, but those aren't personnel reductions. That is simply moving personnel from unrestricted to restricted resources. So, in terms of actual position reductions, the combination between the SERP and the layoff is 37%, so a little over a third.
But the SERP is not a layoff.
It is definitely not a layoff.
So 27%. Okay. And I just want to highlight that because to address really what the community has been asking. You know, what else? What is the plan? So I think this really kind of, so thank you for putting this together, because these are the conversations that we've been having. But I think this outlines it clearly that, you know, it's no small effort to put together, to address this large, what is it, $187 million deficit, when 80% of our spending is on staff. I appreciate the thoughtfulness, not thoughtfulness, but the intentionality of really digging into all of these areas and seeing how elaborately you've been tackling them. So I want to thank our supervisor, Sarmiento, for meeting with the team around direct certification at the county level and how we can do things that will be proactive, and how the county and how he is trying to proactively support our efforts to address these issues. That's a partnership that brings a lot of value when we can actually look at how can folks help us do this together as a community. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and we do too.
I just want to note it's 11:43, and so I know that we're probably gonna have to do something. But Ms. Lepsak.
I'll make it fast. I know you mentioned that we're not buying new vehicles, but tomorrow Taft is having an unveiling of their brand new food truck.
That is, yeah. So that expenditure has been in the works for, I think, more than 2 years now. And so that truck was purchased multiple years ago. It was purchased with grant funds. I understand your point.
Okay, Ms. Brazier-Chavez, final comments.
Yeah, just really quickly, I wanted to point out, you mentioned Oakland Unified, and I actually, in a conversation with CTA and SAEA CTA representatives through SAEA's connecting me with them, they've actually pointed that example out to me. And my understanding is Oakland Unified had lower ratios of staff. No, sorry, we have lower ratios of staff to students than they have. And my understanding from colleagues that, you know, have been on the board in Oakland and just what you were sharing, they're kind of at the brink of receivership.
They are.
I mean, and I don't want to put other districts' business out there, right? But it's public, so I just think for our staff to just kind of like help paint that picture, because that was helpful for me to understand. I'm glad that we are finding these creative, like with the core resolution and other non-staff impact ways to commit to the county that, you know, we're able to handle this responsibly. And just lastly, would you be able to, again, just remind us, because the other thing that the community has been asking about and offering up is the attrition plan. You did speak to it, but my understanding is because we've already had so much positive impact with the SERP, can you highlight again what those numbers that we're projecting for attrition over the next few years?
Well, and so I'll point out quickly that when the two companies that did the SERP analysis, we ultimately selected one of them, but both companies that did the analysis, one of the things they noticed was very low attrition. And it's because of that they actually recommended that we do the 80% figure as a really big incentive to get people to take advantage of that. What they pointed out is because the district is in a habit of doing the SERPs every 4 or 5 years, we're just not going to get a lot of attrition, because people will typically just hold on for a few more years and wait for the next SERP. So what we're seeing, and I think I'm even overstating it when I say it's 15 to 20 people, it could be even less attrition in the credentials that on which we're not overstaffed.
And lastly, for the process, I know that folks are asking for more time, right, to be able to process this and make plans. You mentioned a little bit about how other districts are just in the last few weeks, right before the March 15th deadline, coming out with their reduction in staff. Could you just speak to?
And I don't have any evidence to prove that other districts are going to be pulling the trigger. We have heard rumblings that other districts are making preparations, and it will become public within the next few weeks.
Could you speak to the difference between how we've handled it and why we, and you did, but knowing what we knew, why you brought this forward in November?
So I've worked for multiple school districts. I will say this school district values transparency. This board values transparency a lot. And it would not have felt right to know what we were going to do and not be transparent about it with you, the board, and with the community.
Dr. Alvarez?
Just a really quick question. One last question. Okay, so we're slated to do a reduction of force of 280 people. So March 15th, we have to give notice?
That's the statutory deadline. I know that HR is working hard to try and get those notices into the hands of people earlier.
So March 15th is the deadline. So if someone gets a notice, does that mean that we can still continue to look at options to see if there's anything else that we can do?
Absolutely. So this is a continuous process. We'll have the May revise. We'll have new information. And although I'm not anticipating any new good news, anything's possible. Okay, so anything's possible. So we will see. We will see if there's other streams of revenue, if there are other things that we could do. This doesn't become final until May.
So March 15th is the deadline. What's the next step? What happens between March and May?
So the notices will be in the hands of people before March 15th, probably a week before March 15th. Sometime in April, probably the last week in April, there will be hearings before an administrative law judge to determine whether the reduction in force was done properly. Every person who received a notice has the ability to have that hearing. Once the administrative law judge affirms the reduction in force, then that comes back to the board in May, and at that point in time, the board can rescind some or all, technically, of the layoffs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hacker, for the presentation. And again, this isn't the end of this conversation. So